Lawyers of Reddit. So what point did you realize my client is a monster? Story 1. I once had to listen to a 911 call where my client, a man named Leor, slit the victim's throat while she was still on the line with emergency services. I'll never forget the sound, her gurgling, gasping, and the horror in her voice as she kept repeating, "He killed me, he killed me." Miraculously, she survived. But those sounds still echo in my head. That case was the first time I truly felt like I was defending a monster. Story 2. Years ago, I was handling a DUI case. The government had bungled some paperwork, and I managed to get my client, Harlan, a favorable ruling. Moments before trial, Harlan gave me a bear hug, and he reeked of alcohol. He had driven himself to court. I took his keys and called his mother. That was the moment I realized this man wasn't just irresponsible, he was dangerous. Story 3. One of my former clients, a man in his mid-40s named Jorvik, was accused of molesting a 12-year-old. During our consultation, he tried to explain how the child was coming on to him. I shut that conversation down immediately. No defense strategy in the universe could justify that line of reasoning. Story 4. I once represented a woman named Alira for a grand theft charge. I stepped out to make copies and left her in my office. After she left, I realized my car keys and sunglasses were missing. I found her in the lobby and told her I was done. If she didn't return my belongings immediately, I'd call the police. She emptied her pockets. I never spoke with her again. Story 5. One of my clients, Arno, had just been released from a 25-year prison sentence for murder. That same day, he beat his new landlord so badly that one of the man's eyeballs popped out. Arno laughed as he told me the story. I took the case to trial anyway and, unsurprisingly, lost. He got the maximum, another 10 years. That man truly belonged behind bars. Story 6. I once represented a man named Domar who posed as a doctor to sell steroids. He told cancer patients that his concoctions would cure them. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them died. Knowing he caused that level of false hope and suffering made my skin crawl. Evil isn't always loud. It's sometimes dressed in a lab coat. Story 7. I wasn't directly involved with the case, but I was in the office when we reviewed the background of a woman named Siona. She had been in prison for starving her 3 adopted children until they were hospitalized. After her release, she married a man with children and began starving them too. Her justification? She claimed she was helping them become healthy and beautiful. I've defended accused murderers, but nothing disturbed me like listening to her interviews. Story 8. This one's from a friend who worked as a U.S. Marshal. He was assigned to a case involving thousands of images of child exploitation material. Jurors were required to view every piece of evidence. He told me some of them cried, others vomited, and many shook with rage. Trials would pause for recesses constantly. That case shattered any illusion I had that evil was rare or unseen. Story 9. A teacher of mine, once a lawyer, told us why he left law. His last case involved defending 3 people, 2 couples, who, in a drugged and drunken haze, decided to murder and partially eat one of the women. They dismembered her and stuffed her body parts into an oil drum. The case was open and shut, but the images, the reasoning, and the laughter stuck with him forever. He became a teacher after that. Law had taken too much from him. Story 10. My mother, once a public defender in a small rural district, quit after a particular case. She had to defend a young man and his girlfriend who adopted a kitten from a free to a good home ad. They brought it home and used it as a chew toy for their dog and filmed it. My mother said she needed a shower after every meeting. When the case was over, she tore up her PD contract and never looked back. Story 11. I once had to visit the U.S. Attorney's office to review evidence for a federal case involving my client, a man named Renick. The moment I opened the files, I saw hundreds of images of child exploitation material. They weren't just downloaded content. Many were close-up photos he had taken himself of his own child. There were also pictures of his neighbor's daughters playing in a kiddie pool. He never once admitted guilt or showed a shred of remorse. I remember staring at the screen, realizing this wasn't just a criminal. It was someone fundamentally broken. He ended up receiving 30 years after a very brief jury deliberation. Story 12. A good friend of mine worked as a U.S. Marshal during his early law enforcement years. He told me about trials involving child predators, where the prosecution had to enter thousands of images and videos into the record. The jurors had to view each one as evidence. My friend avoided looking at the monitors, but he watched jurors visibly crumble, Some cried, others shook with rage, and a few actually vomited. The trials took weeks longer than expected because the court had to keep calling recesses just so the jurors could recover. It changed how I looked at the justice system. Some cases don't just scar victims, they scar everyone involved. Story 13. I had a client named Varn who was accused of domestic violence. His girlfriend had been thrown out of a second-story window. He had a terrible criminal history and a very entitled attitude, but that wasn't unusual in my line of work. What puzzled me was how he flat-out refused a plea deal with no jail time. There were 5 eyewitnesses, and the only condition was that he pay her medical bills. His response? "I ain't paying that bitch's bills. Tell them I'll pay for the window." The prosecutor was livid. It was the first time I felt embarrassed to be sitting next to my own client in court. Story 14. One of my high school teachers had previously worked as a criminal defense lawyer. He finally told us why he quit law altogether. His final case involved defending 3 individuals, 2 couples, who had, while intoxicated and high, decided to kill one of the women in their group. They partially ate her and dismembered her body. The evidence was overwhelming, and he had to look at every photo and read every report. The body parts had been stuffed into garbage bags and placed inside an oil drum. When he told us the story, his eyes went far away, like he was still there in that courtroom, trying to forget the details. Story 15. At my firm, we had a case involving a 19-year-old receptionist named Kevra who had quit her job and started working for a competitor. Her former boss, a 57-year-old man named Dovin, wanted us to enforce a post-employment restraint clause against her. When I asked why, he admitted it was because she refused to sleep with him. That was the real reason she left. Despite our advice to drop the case, he insisted on moving forward. We eventually passed him off to another firm because we wanted no part in that vendetta. It was one of the slimiest, most pathetic motivations I've ever seen in civil litigation. Story 16. During my first week at a criminal defense firm, I was assigned to catalog discovery from a client's phone. What I found shocked me. Nearly 4,000 pieces of media, including videos and messages, involving girls under 16, some barely pubescent. He lured them with drugs, filmed them, and trafficked the videos. One clip showed him assaulting a girl, so high on benzodiazepines she could barely move. He claimed he was in love with her. My boss said he wanted to see how tough I was. That case made me physically ill. We reached a plea deal after 2 years. The evidence was overwhelming. That was my first week on the job. Story 17. A friend of mine, a police officer named Jareth, had to undergo major surgery and was placed on desk duty during recovery. One of his temporary assignments was to review thousands of CP images to help identify victims. He spent 3 months doing this. He said after that experience, he could never look at a child again without a wave of dread. Even though he knew it was necessary work, it left a scar on his soul. He told me once that he had nightmares for weeks and refused to talk about most of what he saw. He's still in law enforcement, but only in adult cases now. Story 18. I've practiced criminal defense for decades, and can honestly say the nature of the crime isn't what makes someone a monster, it's the person behind it. I've defended people accused of murder who were more respectful and decent than shoplifters who gave me chills. But the worst ones? The scammers. The ones who steal life savings from elderly people or con families into giving up everything. They smile in court, pretend to be victims, and show no remorse. Murderers often regret what they did. Con artists just regret getting caught. Those are the clients that make it hard to sleep at night, even though I still do my job for them. Story 19. I used to work in the Information Administration Division of a corrections department. One day, a public defender asked me to run a background report on a young man charged with possessing stolen goods. I looked at his file and thought it would be a simple case. But the lawyer looked me dead in the eye and said, "Yeah, but you haven't talked to him or read his psyche val. If he hasn't already killed someone, I'll be shocked. And if he doesn't in the next 5 years, I'll be blown away." That shook me. Some people are like ticking time bombs. You just don't know when they'll go off. Story 20. Back in law school, my general psychology professor used to work as a criminal evaluator for the state of Arcadia. He once told us about a man who would hide glass shards under his skin, slipping them into open wounds, presumably to use as weapons later. During their interview, my professor said he felt every hair on his neck stand up. The man was calm, articulate, and deeply frightening. He wouldn't say why he hid the glass, but we all knew it wasn't for self-defense. That story stuck with me. It was one of those moments where I realized how thin the line is between sanity and something much darker. Story 21. I once had a client, Marla, who was being held on charges of attempting to sell her own baby. I found out during a court hearing, right in front of the judge. I'm a lawyer in a very poor country, so sadly, this wasn't even the first time I'd seen something like this. It sounds unthinkable, but sometimes the reality is that a sold baby might have a better chance at life than one left to starve. There are always couples out there desperate to adopt who don't want to deal with the bureaucracy of formal adoption. Still, defending someone in that situation was one of the hardest moral knots I've ever faced. Story 22. About 25 years ago, I worked with a guy named Leston. Some coworkers told me that his father had been a divorce lawyer who was murdered by a client's ex-husband. I never asked Leston directly. It felt too personal. This was before the internet made everything searchable, so I couldn't verify it. The story went that the ex-husband held his father hostage in his own home before killing him. What struck me most was that Leston eventually went into law as well. I always thought he had the makings of a real-life superhero origin story. Last I heard, though, he left law altogether and became a bartender. I can't blame him. Story 23. One of the most disturbing clients I ever had was a man named Draven, a husband and father who absolutely refused to care for his autistic son. He disowned the boy and tried to argue that he deserved all of his wife's retirement benefits, even though he hadn't worked in over a decade. During Hurricane Serial, he called me from the Bronx while I was in downtown Elyria, demanding that I file contempt charges because his wife hadn't paid him that day. He also told me I'd regret getting married. Months later, he sent death threats to me and my wife. Before the divorce was finalized, he took his own life. Story 24. On a lighter but still frustrating note, I once had a client named Vinya during a child custody dispute. She called me repeatedly on Memorial Day, insisting it was urgent. I finally picked up and told her I was only answering because it sounded serious. She replied, "Oh, I didn't think Jews celebrated Memorial Day, so I figured you'd be available." I was stunned. I didn't even know how to respond. This wasn't my worst client by far, but definitely my dumbest. The lack of basic awareness combined with the entitlement made me wonder how she functioned in daily life, let alone as a parent fighting for custody. Story 25. Two of my closest friends are in law enforcement. One is a police constable, the other a crown attorney. Over the years, they've seen things most people couldn't imagine. One case involved reviewing hundreds of thousands of images, videos, and even audio recordings of child exploitation. I asked why so much material had to be reviewed. Wasn't a small sample enough? They explained it wasn't about convictions, it was about identifying victims. A reflection in a mirror, a newspaper, furniture patterns. Anything could be a clue. Some victims were saved because of this. That's when I realized how critical and soul-destroying this work can be. It's not just prosecution, it's rescue. Story 26. I used to work as a police officer in the child protection team. Every week, I was assigned to classify child exploitation images. I had to determine the legal category of each one, which meant viewing them in full. I can't describe the toll it took. Some of those images are burned into my memory forever. We had access to a psychologist every 3 months. Ours, a woman named Dahlia, handled our whole unit, but after 2 years, she quit. I heard she just couldn't deal with the emotional weight anymore. I don't blame her. That job changed me forever. Even now, I avoid anything involving children. It's too much. Story 27. My mother once defended a man accused of murdering his entire family, his wife and 3 young children ages 3, 4, and 7. He killed them with an axe and then burned their bodies. She said she was genuinely afraid to be in the same room with him. He stared at her for long, uncomfortable moments without saying a word. She told me he didn't seem human. It's one of the few cases that still haunts her. He was sentenced to death. She was relieved. She didn't care about the money or the outcome, except that he would never be free again. That case made her question her entire career. Story 28. I worked against child predators for several years, and something I noticed repeatedly still chills me. The way many of them stare. It's not just blank or distant, it's cold, calculating. One of the more experienced agents told me, "They're studying you, hunting you. You just don't know it yet." These people often see others as less than human, so they're not concerned about appearing normal. They mimic emotions to get close to their victims. That stare, it's not just creepy, it's predatory. It's the same look a lion gives in the grass. Once you've seen it enough times, you can't unsee it. Every time I see it, I feel sick inside. Story 29. I currently work with people on death row. To be honest, I've never thought of any of my clients as monsters. Some have committed horrible, unspeakable crimes. But most of the time, I find myself thinking, how do I convince my own children never to try meth? Because meth psychosis is real and terrifying. Or I think, I'm lucky to have had a stable upbringing. Many of my clients had lives full of violence, addiction, and mental illness. Some thrive in prison because it finally gives them structure. It's not about excusing their crimes, it's about seeing the full picture. Evil often grows in places without light, not from birth. Story 30. I worked as a paralegal for years, and one client I'll never forget was part of a custody battle. The client and their ex made their autistic 12-year-old son sit at the kitchen table and choose which parent he wanted to live with. The client called me afterward to brag that the boy picked them. They wanted the paperwork filed immediately. Both parents were well off, respected in their fields, and utterly oblivious to how damaging this was. That child wasn't mature enough to make that decision, nor should he have been forced to. I left family law not long after. That case still makes me feel physically ill. Story 31. Years ago, I worked as a solicitor's representative in Crown Court cases, handling paperwork, prepping clients, the usual. One of the most disturbing cases involved a man named Farron, who was in his 70s. He had already served 15 years for abusing a child and was close to release. Everyone, guards, evaluators, had given him clean reports. But one day, during a dental trip outside prison, he saw 2 children in the waiting room and immediately charged at them. The guards intervened just in time. 3 weeks later, I had to explain that he wouldn't be released, but was instead being committed to a secure psychiatric facility indefinitely. He didn't take it well. Story 32. The original offense Farron had served time for? He wasn't just a physical abuser. He created and distributed child abuse material and directly harmed his victims. The details were so grim that when I learned what he'd done, I felt no sympathy for his new sentence. There was no question about his danger to society. Ultimately, the mental health tribunal committed him to a secure facility for the rest of his life. Given his age and the severity of his crimes, that meant he would die there. I've worked with many difficult clients, but that one made me question whether some people are simply incapable of any kind of rehabilitation. Story 33. During law school, I interned at a high-profile criminal defense firm. One summer, I was assigned to a conspiracy to commit murder case involving multiple defendants. Our client, Sarek, was one of them. The worst part? I had to review hours of video footage that showed people being hacked to death. One video showed someone's skull being stomped until their brain spilled out. Another showed a man screaming while his limbs were severed. These weren't grainy security feeds. These were filmed in HD up close. I had to listen carefully to identify voices. I'll never forget the laughter in the background. It changed me. I still have nightmares. I never returned to criminal law. Story 34. After that summer internship, I walked away from criminal defense completely. I finished law school and went into civil litigation instead. I now help victims recover damages, and while the work is demanding, it doesn't leave me spiritually shattered. That case, the one with the dismemberment videos, left a permanent scar. I remember praying that each one of those men got the electric chair. I had to meet our client face to face, knowing what he'd probably done. It felt like sitting across from a demon. That job taught me that some cases don't just test your skill, they test your soul. I still believe in justice, but I never want to feel that darkness again. Story 35. My friend, a fellow lawyer, once represented a woman named Kalira. She and her partner had adopted 2 boys. These boys were so severely starved that they ate the wallpaper off the walls. They eventually ran away and were found digging through a neighbor's trash cans. When the police arrived, they assumed the boys were about 8 or 9 years old. But during questioning, they revealed their real ages, 19 and 20. They were so malnourished they looked like children. Once they were rescued, they ate so much they vomited. That's how hungry they were. The adoptive parents were tried and convicted. That case still horrifies everyone who worked on it. Story 36. In one of the most disturbing animal cruelty cases I encountered, my mother, who was a public defender, represented a man named Grell. He and his girlfriend had adopted a kitten from a free to a good home listing. They brought it home and gave it to their dog to use as a chew toy. Even worse, they filmed it happening. My mother, who had handled some rough cases in her time, said she felt the need to scrub herself clean after every meeting with him. Once the case concluded, she canceled her public defender contract and never returned. That case broke her spirit. It was the final straw. Story 37. I had a client named Ofer who pretended to be a doctor. He sold steroids to terminally ill patients, convincing them that his product could cure their cancer. They believed him. They paid him thousands, some their life savings. And some of them died. He didn't just scam people, he gave them hope and then exploited it. I remember thinking, this is evil in its quietest form. There was no blood, no violence, just lies, manipulation, and death. I still had to defend him, of course. That's part of the job. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sitting next to someone who had destroyed lives without lifting a finger. Story 38. A colleague of mine once worked a case involving a man named Dren, who was caught with thousands of images and videos of child exploitation. But what disturbed her most wasn't the sheer volume. It was one specific video. In it, a young girl was heavily sedated and clearly not consenting as Dren assaulted her. When confronted, he insisted he was in love with her. He believed that justified everything. He had also filmed many underage girls being intimate with each other in hotel rooms. It was her first week at the firm. The experience shook her to the core. That case was her introduction to criminal law. A brutal one. Story 39. I once represented a man named Kelvin, who was facing a domestic violence charge. His girlfriend had been badly injured. He threw her out of a second-story window. The state offered him a plea deal with no jail time if he paid her medical bills. Surprisingly, he refused. He said, "I'm not paying that bitch's bills. Tell them I'll pay for the window." Despite the 5 witnesses and clear evidence, he thought he could negotiate. I was stunned. He wasn't just entitled, he was delusional. The prosecutor was furious. It was one of those moments where I realized some clients don't want a defense, they want revenge. And I wasn't about to help with that. Story 40. I used to handle mostly family law cases, and one that still sits heavy with me involved a divorce between a couple with an autistic 12-year-old boy. My client, let's call them Tavern, and their ex forced the child to sit at the kitchen table and choose which parent he wanted to live with. He wasn't emotionally or developmentally equipped to make that decision. Afterward, Tavern called me to brag that the boy had chosen them and asked me to start filing paperwork. I was disgusted. This wasn't a victory, it was cruelty dressed up as empowerment. Neither parent had the child's well-being in mind. I left family law not long after. Story 41. A close friend of mine, also a family lawyer, once told me about a truly heartbreaking case. In front of a judge and their autistic child, both parents took turns arguing why they shouldn't have custody. They claimed the other was better suited, that they were too busy, or that the child clearly preferred the other parent. The child sat there, silent and confused, while their caregivers treated them like an inconvenience. It was one of the most emotionally brutal scenes my friend had ever witnessed in court. You could tell the judge was barely holding it together. That child didn't need a legal decision, they needed parents who gave a damn. Story 42. Years ago, I worked as a solicitor's rep, mostly helping with paperwork and client coordination in Crown Court. One case involved a man named Herrick who had spent 15 years in prison for sexually abusing a child. His legal team was trying to get him released, citing good behavior and positive evaluations. But during a medical trip outside the prison, he saw 2 children in a waiting room and immediately lunged at them. He was stopped by guards. 3 weeks later, I had the grim task of informing him that he wasn't going free. Instead, he was being committed to a mental health facility for the rest of his life. He exploded in rage. Story 43. Herrick's original crime wasn't a one-time offense. He had created, distributed, and personally committed child abuse. The materials were horrifying. The psychological evaluations said he was a high risk to reoffend, and after the dentist office incident, nobody doubted it. He was eventually committed under an indefinite sentence to a secure psychiatric unit. Given his age and history, it was essentially a life sentence. I don't celebrate incarceration, but in this case, I felt strangely at peace with the outcome. There was no redemption arc here, just a dangerous man who had fooled the system for years. He nearly got out. Thankfully, he didn't. Story 44. During my first summer working at a criminal defense firm, I was assigned to a conspiracy to commit murder case. Our client, Visker, was one of several people charged. The crime was brutal. 3 people had been killed, and others had helped plan, abduct, or film the murders. I had to review the videos for voice identification. They were HD recordings, close-up footage of people being dismembered and beaten to death. One person's brain literally spilled out after their head was stomped. What struck me most wasn't the violence, it was the laughter in the background. It never left me. That summer changed my life. I never went back to criminal law after that. Story 45. When my internship ended, I didn't pursue a career in criminal law. I had seen too much. I spent nights awake, praying that the people responsible for those murders would face the harshest penalties possible. I still did my job, reviewed audio, filed motions, and helped with strategy, but I felt dirty doing it. One jail visit stands out. I sat across from our client, knowing what he'd likely done. He tried making small talk. I could hardly look at him. After that summer, I transitioned into civil litigation. Now I help people recover from harm, rather than defend those who cause it. That case still haunts me, over a decade later. Story 46. Not my case, but one I heard about early in my career still gives me chills. A woman named Alira had previously been convicted for starving her 3 adopted children. They were hospitalized and barely alive. After serving her sentence, she married a man with children and started doing it again. She justified it by saying she was helping them be healthy and beautiful. I listened to an interview she gave, and her tone was calm, even cheerful, like she truly believed she was doing something good. I've worked on murder cases that didn't disturb me as much. There's something terrifying about someone being so deluded and so cruel at once. Story 47. I remember a case from years back involving a family that starved their 2 sons to the point where they were eating wallpaper off the walls. The boys eventually ran away and were found scavenging through a neighbor's garbage bins. When the police questioned them, they guessed the boys were around 8 or 9. In reality, they were 19 and 20. They were so malnourished they looked like children. Once taken into care, they ate so much food they vomited. That detail stuck with me, the desperation, the physical toll. The parents were convicted. I didn't work the case personally, but just hearing about it made me lose sleep. Story 48. At the beginning of my legal career, I worked on a case that involved reviewing a client's phone data. This man, Lazarin, had over 4,000 pieces of media involving underage girls, most of them barely in puberty. He used drugs to lure them in and filmed everything. One video showed him assaulting a girl who was clearly incapacitated and choking. When confronted, he said he did it because he was in love with her. He also forced these girls to have sex with each other in hotel rooms while he filmed. It was my first week at the firm. That case was a brutal initiation. It made me question everything. Story 49. One of the most bone-chilling things I've ever heard came from a psychology professor who assessed criminals for the state. He told me about a man who had glass shards under his skin. Not just once, he would reopen wounds and slide pieces in, presumably to use later as weapons. The professor said during the interview, every hair on his body stood up. The man was eerily calm, collected, and utterly terrifying. It wasn't just about the glass, it was the mindset behind it. He planned for violence like someone plans for an afternoon nap. That story stayed with me more than anything I learned in law school.